Yeah, I think those numbers are stable. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. My name is Kenneth Damien. I'm the chair of the LSE Alumni Association in London. And together with the LSESU Future Impact Society and the CEMS Club St Gallen, we're delighted to invite you to this Careers of the Future panel event. We'll be looking at the risks and opportunities that the post-COVID world offers from the perspectives of the impact of AI and tech, climate change, and shifting geopolitics, and hope to look at how some of these issues intermingle. We're hoping to ground the discussion in distilling those kind of high-level discussions into practical insights that you guys can take away and kind of consider in your day-to-day. The event is intended to be interactive. I will do my best to moderate a discussion that kind of lays the buffet, as it were, and then the second half, so roughly 50-50, 45 minutes apiece, we're going to go into audience Q&A. The Q&A function should be at the bottom of your Zoom dial-in. So feel free to submit them as the panel discussion is going on. We'll then kind of curate those and kind of try and answer all the questions we can within 45 minutes with me putting your questions to the panel and carry that discussion along. I'm going to invite the panelists to introduce themselves, but just some of you may have noticed that Anna Alex from Planetly, unfortunately, is not part of the panel. She wasn't able to make the event due to personal reasons, but Martina has very kindly offered to step in at the last minute and, absolutely, doing us all a really big favor. And, we're looking forward to her insights and the insights of the rest of the panelists. And with that, I think I'd like to invite the panel to introduce themselves. David, would you mind if we kick off with you?
It's great to be here. Thanks so much, Kenneth. So I'm chair of London Futurists, but my past life included 25 years in the early days of mobile computing and smartphones. And in that role, I was head of research for a while, which certainly involved looking forwards to how mobile phones, smartphones could be used in the future. And I guess I found out that the future wasn't just determined by technology. The future was very much determined by a whole bunch of other trends, including human trends. So that's what I'm looking forward to discussing this evening.
Thank you very much, David. Lee, would you like to go next?
Thanks. Yeah. Good evening, everyone. My name is Lee Howell, and actually, I'm part of the CEMS program at St Gallen. I teach a course there on disruption and innovation, and focus on what we sort of commonly know as the Fourth Industrial Revolution. But my day job is that I'm a managing director, member of the managing board of the World Economic Forum in Geneva, Switzerland, where I've been responsible for the global programming, also for our regional activities, but as well as been the editor of our global risk report. So I'm delighted to be here.
Fantastic, thank you, Lee. So translation, we will be expecting very nuanced and intelligent questions from your students, if any of them have dialed in to the panel.
That's right, and they've been graded. Their course has been graded, so they're free to go live.
So no extra cred, obviously. And last but certainly not least, Martina, over to you.
Thank you very much. Yes, my name is Martina Macpherson. I'm the head of ESG strategy at ODDO BHF Asset Management and Private Equity. I've also got multiple hats on here. I'm a visiting fellow at the University of Zurich and Henley Business School, so undertake academic research in the fields of and themes of ESG and ESG investing, and there are, of course, many. We will touch on some of them and the links to innovation today. And last but not least, I'm the president for the Network for Sustainable Financial Markets, and that's a next-gen think tank. And we look at education, capacity building, and advocacy in the fields of sustainable finance and ESG investing. And we try really to contribute also to the debate when and where sustainability, innovation, progress, and the next generation converge. So hopefully we have a bit of time to talk about the future of work and the next generation as well in this context.
Oh, I certainly hope so, Martina. Fantastic. All right, so to kick things off, I think I think it's been, needless to say, quite the year or year and a half for most of us coming through a period of lockdown and looking back and assessing the impact on COVID on society, on our working lives, etc. David, so to kick things off, as a futurist and someone coming from a technology background, How do you see the trends that have played out during the course of the COVID crisis in our working lives, be it remote working, be it how we measure productivity, be it the impact of technology and technology related companies? Which of those trends do you think are here to stay? How do you think that is going to shape working lives in the medium to long term? And is there a case for tempering some of those more bullish comparisons?
Well, this is a great topic, and it's a huge topic, and I'll just dip into it a bit. We futurists sometimes want to emphasize exponential change. We grew up in evolutionary times without seeing exponentials. We're used to linear or cyclical variations, but a lot of what futurists want to draw attention to is exponentials, in which things grow slowly, and then fast, go through this disappointing phase of underperforming expectations before this fast phase of overperforming expectations. And it's right to draw attention to exponentials, but we sometimes mislead the conversation when we imply that these curves are smooth and predictable. They're nothing like smooth and predictable. And instead, they're often covered in jerks or jolts. And what causes the most long-term change is often an external shock, which changes the dynamics and brings forward changes that were previously expected, but delayed and expected and delayed. And then as a result of the shock, they move much more quickly. And that's what COVID is doing. COVID is probably going to change the trend towards urbanization and towards more commuting. People have been predicting for a long time that we would have more people working from home, that people would spend less time commuting, and it didn't happen. But now I think people have seen enough of a different way of living that it's quite likely that there's going to be a flip. Today, most people are away from the office when they're working, 8 or 10 weeks in a year on holidays or business trips, and they're in the office accordingly, maybe 42 or 44 weeks a year. I think it's quite possible it's going to flip to the other way around, that we're going to be working away from the office most of the time, and we will be co-locating for all kinds of important reasons, but we don't need to be co-located the whole time. That's one of the ways in which COVID is impacting us. But frankly, I don't think we've fully appreciated COVID yet. It's still early days. Things are still a bit too raw. We're still in the midst of some terrible things happening around the world with COVID. And I think in the next year, we're going to look back and we're going to say, oh my goodness, did we really do this? Oh my goodness, did we really not do that? And I think that's going to cause yet further flips and cause us to look at all kinds of new ways of organizing society, which will in part use robotics and drones more than before, and will encourage companies to find ways to operate distributed rather than concentrated. And by the way, of course, many companies say, oh, we need to work together because that's how we do things around here. And many of the processes in these companies do depend upon co-location. Well, guess what? There will be new companies that are born distributed. And these companies won't have the same overheads, the same old patterns, and many of them will then set new standards. And the companies that are not born distributed will probably struggle and have to adapt. So that's just a few of the things that we probably will see happening.
So just a follow-up question on that, David. And I know we've spoken before about the advent of smart cities, perhaps the delocalization of the prominence that maybe major urban hubs hold at present. If that's true, and there is a future where, for example, someone could be professionally located in London, but could be working anywhere in the world, what does that mean for what would you think? Just and obviously we're all looking into a collective crystal ball here, but what do you think that would mean for the development of skills and professional reputation at both for a young graduate who's just starting out? Is it a trend that they should definitely take seriously in looking at opportunities outside of major hubs? And for someone who's already established and perhaps a bit more entrenched in their career, what is the perspective that they might look at some of these trends from?
Well, it used to be the case that we had to figure out good ways of using our commuting time. We spent a long time commuting. And so people who were good at their jobs found ways to do some work on the train, despite of everything else. Well, now the emphasis is going to be slightly different. It's going to be developing skills to work well while remote. And not just struggling along with Zoom and all the related technologies, but really mastering it and figuring out how to have the equivalent of water cooler movements, even while remote. And so it always is the case that we see successful people are those who are literate at any given time. So in the past, you had to become experts in the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. And then people said, well, if you're not IT literate, you're going to fall behind. Well, increasingly now, people are going to need to be AI literate and remote comms literate, in which we are able to use this technology without getting depressed or tired or bewildered. And we're able to sparkle with it rather than not seeing the best of it. And so that's part of the general picture, which is if we're going to thrive in this world of more technology, we have to become comfortable at coexisting with it, comfortable with how to configure it best, comfortable with how to design it best.
Thanks, David. So Lee, just to link onto something that David mentioned, which is the emphasis on skills. I'd say for the longest time, and maybe this trend holds true looking forward, the job market has very much operated on the basis of representation, certification, being able to show that you have a certain set of skills and then being hired for it. Whereas if I'm taking some of the comments that David mentioned in his remarks, it seems like then there is the possibility of there being more of a shift towards, perhaps not in all sectors, but definitely in some, an emphasis on skills rather than certifications and representation. Is that something that you think could be valid? To what extent, and to what extent do you think that holds true?
Well, thanks, Kenneth. Let me just first start with maybe so my framework and approaching what I think COVID will do is first. I think we're just now understanding what's going to be the winning or the dominant narratives here. And by narratives, I mean probably many of you here are familiar with Robert Shiller's latest book about narrative economics. And essentially, he talks about how small stories or stories can go viral and influence, collective or individual behavior. It's not really a story because I think he's right to say it's a narrative. Narrative, you have a sense of agency that you feel like you could do something. So for a moment, if we could just imagine pre-COVID, what was sort of the big narrative in this space, right? And there was a lot of concern around offshoring of very high-skilled jobs. There was this fourth industrial revolution that was, we were going through machine learning to make, many of the professional job, sort of careers we think about, be it if you're a tax accountant or lawyer, can soon be sort of, automated. That was the narrative. COVID hits, and I think, it's a moment really just to reflect on what changed. And unlike other shocks, and David mentioned it, there's always an exogenous big shock. I think this is very different in the sense that it was very global, in the sense that we were very globally aware, but each community had to deal with it in its own way. The firefighters that were in the C-suite were different. It wasn't the CTO of a cyber attack or the CFO because it was a market meltdown. It was really the chief human resource officers, right? We started to see, in terms of the resilience, we're starting to realize that what were the critical systems? It wasn't just IT, it was the healthcare system, the childcare system. I mean, that was all really very critical systems that had to be operating. So in all of that, what's the narrative that's emerging? And that is going to inform, I think, the collective and individual choices we make, or maybe the bets we put on the skills we want. And I'm very cautious to say what that's going to be, except I do agree with David that this is not an interruption. This is really a disruption. It's going to accelerate a lot of things. But, it's important to realize that when we talk about who was essential during this crisis, it really wasn't sort of the people with the skills that you described per se, right? In a way, the most, and it was interesting because when we were sort of overcome by this fourth industrial revolution narrative about how it might displace all of us in our professional training, people talked about, well, it's going to be the person-to-person job, the service jobs that we safe because you have to have, COVID also changed that. We couldn't be in contact with others. So I think before jumping into what the skills are, it's good to reflect on what we would need, not necessarily skills, but attributes. I think resilience. I think people, we will, employers and the like, ourselves a lot, it's testing our resilience. And will most of us be able to bounce back better? And what are the attributes? Yeah, and what are the things that will make us more resilient in this crisis? Second, I do think there's one thing that's probably lifelong learning. And to David's point that we will have to continue to learn and adapt. And I think there may be, and I'll stop here, maybe two big pieces of that, drivers of that, that lifelong learning. One, I think, will be clearly digitalization in all its forms. The second is maybe it's linked to Martina, but I certainly believe that sort of the energy transition to to a zero carbon world, it's going to be a big adaptation for us as workers, as consumers, as producers. So I think those two things. So I don't know. I mean, Kenneth, to your question about the actual skill sets, I do think learning will be much more important. Resilience will be much more important. And I think there's things beyond COVID that are staring us in the face, like digitalization, as well as the climate, and in terms of our transition to a net zero economy. Those are the big ones that we'll have to develop new skills and hone skills. And lastly, I would just say it's new skills, not reskilling, and that's something maybe we'll talk about, because I think that's a bit of a misnomer to talk about how we're going to reskill ourselves. I have some doubts about that, but I do think there are some skills we'll have to acquire.
Well, I think just to draw upon that, and thanks very much for your comments, Lee. I think they're very on the ball. Just to draw on the kind of the comment I made, and perhaps to frame it in a practical example, I think what I was trying to get at is, for example, in my work as a lawyer, there is a reason that sectors such as the legal services sector are regulated, and that's because the work is highly specialized. It carries outsized risk, so you should hire a professional that's certified to do those things. However, the nature of the legal services themselves can be split. And for anyone who is a practicing lawyer is interested in legal services, there's a great legal futurist / thinker called Richard Susskind, and he makes a distinction between kind of bespoke legal skills or bespoke services and kind of standardized services. And the bespoke legal services is kind of the bet the farm litigation, tax advice, very specialized stuff that you can't necessarily just plug into a computer. Whereas the standardized legal skills is more like run-of-the-mill contract work, etc. And a lot of the things that I've read, to frame it in those two narratives, on the one hand, your certification as a lawyer marks you out as someone who can carry out this specialized work up to a certain standard. But then at the same time, a lot of the business of legal services is subsidized by the standardized legal work, which maybe isn't as complicated and maybe doesn't require certification at that level. Now, that's kind of a broad oversimplification, but that, to me, that kind of setup where you have competing forces that can deliver the skills base at low cost is ripe for disruption, right?
Well, let me on that point, a great way to frame it. Thank you, Kenneth. One, I think, of course, in a way, you're also as trained lawyers as well. I mean, we are, let's just say, not the most open profession, right, for newcomers and the like.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah, right. I won't say we're a guild, but anyways, I think the point is there's two ways. I think there's going to be a move towards micro accreditation, and it's not going to be through the formalized institutions, because look, the cost, the amount of the opportunity cost of going 3 years, 4 years in university, and then doing your clerkship and all that. So maybe you can get that delta, which you're describing, through a really micro accreditation program from non-traditional sources of accreditation in terms of at least the training, right? There's a second side, though, and then of course there's the technology. If I'm in Switzerland, if you're a notary, why do we have distributed ledger, blockchain technology? That should just wipe out a lot of that stuff. And you're right, if you're in the deeds and trust kind of business and home sales and things. But I would argue that there's maybe one area, though, that's very interesting in all of this COVID, and that's been a lot of research on how people work online and through these, even if you're offshoring some of your legal work. There's certain things that it's very difficult to do like this. One is actually negotiation, conflict resolution. So there, I think you have a different skill set, and you're going to have physical presence to negotiate and resolve conflicts. But in those other domains, yes, I do think like blockchain and other technologies even will just and along with machine learning, will take a lot of that work out of the current system. And then I do think there is an opportunity for this sort of micro accreditation and learning from different places all along and building up a CV rather than sort of saying, 3 years or 4 years, I did my bachelor's in law or my Juris Doctor at JD. I think, that can change.
Absolutely. Martina, so just to pivot a little bit, Lee did mention the green energy kind of transition, but I actually want to draw upon something related, but maybe a little bit different, which is ESG and ESG trends, which is obviously your area of expertise. And in particular, I think one thing, first of all, is for me in particular, when I started reading about ESG, it did feel like a lot of the discussion was kind of structured around how to deal with climate change and environmental policy, whereas ESG itself, when you dig into it, is much wider than that and deals with issues of governance and can encapsulate things as wide as cybersecurity, workers' rights, etc. How have you seen those trends play out within the current COVID crisis, and what do you think that says about what the future is for those trends, and to what extent do they present risks and opportunities from a professional basis, either for someone who wants to specialize in that field or for someone who just generally has an interest and wants to support them?
Well, absolutely. Nice to meet you all. And Kenneth, I couldn't agree more with, first of all, one of your statements to say ESG is much more than E. And I think that's where currently the challenge is. It's not only E, it's very often investors start the journey, so the businesses, on the climate risk side. And it's no surprise here because obviously climate change mitigation and adaptation has really achieved an enormous momentum, also led by the global awareness / the policy commitments that have actually followed the Paris Agreement of 2015. But the spectrum of ESG and the track record is much broader and much longer than this particular snapshot in time, right? So ultimately, maybe we could look at ESG from two perspectives and then really drill a bit further than E and really go into S, because I think this sits alongside the trajectory of today's discussion, is that when we are looking at ESG now and ESG investing, we're talking of more than 40 trillion US dollars, and that's an amount up from around 12 trillion in just 2012, so less than a decade ago. And this growth momentum is continuing. We are potentially seeing here estimates that by 20 and in the next 20 years, so by 2040 roughly, after the 2030s agenda's goals have hopefully been reached, that there might be again asset growth of up to 15 to 20 trillion in addition to what we are seeing now, which obviously takes an enormous focus and market emphasis when we talk about the sheer scope and scale of ESG and the momentum that has been achieved. We should also talk briefly here in this context of what is driving this. Clearly, investor sentiment, demand from millennials, from female and from high net worth investors. We see clearly also regulatory developments and drivers. You talked about the legal aspects. They have regulation and legislation has a fundamental role, especially in the EU now, to play when and where ESG momentum is concerned. But then, of course, you see also the increasing preferences, when and where financial products are concerned, for instance, in this market. And that's where I come in, representing an asset management firm. So the risk and opportunities in ESG investing are better understood, and there are multiple approaches now. When you look at screening, when you look at integration, when you look at active ownership and engagement, that are actually driving investment management and decision-making processes. And generally, we have moved the needle from risk mitigation to growth and opportunities management strategies and impact. And again, that's moved the needle from historically a niche type of ethical or SRI approach when and where, social responsible investments were concerned, to a much broader interest and uptake across active and passive investing. So that's maybe very briefly the context. And then in what we are now seeing in 2020 to 21, dominated clearly, and others have highlighted this, by the COVID pandemic and the rising awareness of inequalities in societies generally. Just look at Black Lives Matters, another strong S social movement, that the importance of S issues are coming to the fore. And these are socioeconomic issues. These are societal issues. These are social, micro-social or micro-level social issues that are concerning companies and issuers, as well as obviously governance and other state actors at large. And of course, they have finally made their way also in investment decision-making. So from S and around adaptation towards resilience, what we are seeing is the increasing focus. There are really three major themes emerging. One is the future of work and the ways how to work in uncertain times. So the strong focus on human capital management with a trajectory towards and a scenario perspective towards the future and what might this bring. Then, of course, the impact on the global workforce when and where employment is concerned, growth and prosperity. So really clearly also socioeconomic tendencies, and ultimately resilience and how businesses can manage the COVID crisis and their workforces, you know, in the context of not only a transition, but clearly a transformational change that's up upon us. And I think that's very much overdue, because we have seen, you know, that over the last few decades, especially human capital management has undergone significant change. You know, we will touch on this, you know, automation, digitalization, remote working is part of this trend. But ultimately now we have seen there's also polarization when and where workforces and skills are concerned. You know, we have a vast amount of low-skilled workers in the gig economy. It's been often criticized. Likewise, we have now a new type of very high-skilled workers that have a good understanding of the skills of tomorrow, where, for instance, AI and fintech solutions are concerned. But this growing disparity in the valuation of low and high-skilled human capital is really one of the key dominating factors as well, and challenges that we see in the so-called knowledge economy. And sorry for that lengthy explanation.
No. But I mean, it's a lengthy topic area, so completely understandable. One big thing I get from reading about ESG, or rather what ESG seeks to achieve, is really what we're talking about is internalizing certain aspects of the economic supply chain cycle that were previously just non-considerations or externalities completely. You know, we mentioned climate change. You also mentioned a more equitable, you know, workforce and things like that. And within that context, I think it's interesting because from a layman's perspective, if you're trying to pick weapons to right those wrongs, finance wouldn't be your natural weapon of choice, right? But it plays a very important role in terms of accounting for and internalizing actionable risk within our systems. And I thought a very interesting example, because the other hat you hold as president of the Network for Sustainable Financial Markets. And I thought there was a very, and I'm hoping you're going to be able to pick up the cue and lead with it, but there was a very interesting project that you did in relation to bees and pollinators. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Because I thought there was a very interesting intersection between what we're talking about here and the practical application.
Sure, very much so. And you bring a topic to the fore that's also close to my mind and heart. I mean, ultimately, biodiversity and ecosystem collapse. We touched on E is not just climate. Where does that lead us from here? You know, and I've recently been the co-editor of the new and upcoming Routledge Guide on Biodiversity. The book is currently going into publication. So Jill Atkins and myself are very delighted that we brought 30 experts across, you know, the industry and policy making, regulatory side, and corporates together to actually highlight the different challenges, the need for more frameworks and taxonomies and metrics, and ultimately for financial solutions, as what you highlighted, maybe the weapons for good. Very often the denomination echo barrier comes to mind. You know, what you need to do is actually identify the relevant solutions to tackle the issues. And that book is an exact follow-on from what we did back in 2016, which was the first part of the 3-book series now, that actually looked into the financial and economic impacts linked to the extinction crisis, the extinction of the pollinators, to be precise. Now in the new biodiversity book, we talk in line with the IPBES report of the extinction crisis overall, you know, ultimately looking across mammals and civilization of what these impacts might have. But yeah, very much so. I think it's not a bees book. It's not a book for beekeepers. On the contrary, we actually launched this as an initiative for the financial services sector, and Hermes Federated and other investors at the time kickstarted an anti-engagement campaign to look at how we can preserve our current, for instance, food and beverage chain that's heavily dependent on the natural ecosystem. And 2/3 of our local produce will disappear with the extinction of the pollinators. And that particular crisis is as imminent and the next tragedy on the horizon. So exactly that, highlighting these type of issues, setting them into context, and ultimately measuring and defining the financial and economic impacts and outcomes of these type of issues. That's exactly the type of work that the eco-varia in financial, or various in financial services, such as myself, are currently undertaking.
Fantastic. Just to everyone listening on the call, just in case you dialed in a little bit late, there's a Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom call. So if you do have questions for the speakers, I see we've got a couple streaming in on the chat, but do feel free to add those in, and we'd be delighted to put those to the panelists. Switching gears slightly, but building on what Martina just said, David, and I know this is something that you'll be looking at in your new book. Within the context of climate change, but also I think within the context of applying technology for a social end, for to benefit society at large. What do you see as being the major trends that are going to inform that, both from a perspective of key technologies that are going to have that impact, but also the new burgeoning economies that those would build?
So I'm a fan of the narrative of the fourth industrial revolution, which Lee mentioned. I think it is a correct analysis that there is a bunch of technologies which are today still at an early and immature phase in fields such as biotech, neurotech, nanotech, and information technology. And when I say information technology, I mean next generation artificial intelligence. I don't just mean more of what we got today. I believe there are multiple potential breakthroughs which people are looking at, which could significantly improve the caliber of our AI systems. And so I think it's pretty likely that in 10 years' time, we will be looking at a very different caliber of artificial intelligence to what we've got today. It won't just be automating the routine aspects of our work, so-called robotic process automation. And there will be plenty of that, and it will be more in 10 years' time than there is today, but it won't just be that. There will be AI that is increasingly used for creative tasks too. And we've got some of this already. There are things called generative adversarial networks, sometimes called GANs, which are generating remarkably impressive pictures or even videos. Other software is generating music that if you play it to an audience who doesn't know where it comes from, and tell them that it might be an original piece by Bach, or it might be written by some software, they will say, oh, it's so good, it must have been written by Bach. And so there is use of software in creative works. I think also there will be a flourishing of affective computing. Affective computing is computing that understands human emotions and is able to augment and enhance our emotional state. So we will see work done by robots in the care system. And there is a connection here with COVID. There have been crises in which care homes have had difficulties getting humans to do various tasks. And at least in some places, people would have said, well, if we'd had robots to do it, they would have been fine in the circumstances. Maybe not what we initially wanted, but in a time of crisis, beggars can't be choosers. And I think there will be a roll out of software that does these affective computing as well, and manifest compassion. And so I think AI is going to change the world much more radically. And what humans can do is we have to be able to keep track of it. We have to be able to learn new things about AI. We have to be able to figure out how we can complement whatever AIs can do at the moment. And at any one moment, there are going to be things that humans will do better than the AIs. And so we will still have roles to do, but that boundary won't be fixed. Maybe in another couple of years, it will have changed again. And then we're going to have to be able to pick up a slightly different set of tasks. And so the soft skill that is very important I think Lee said it very well earlier. There is the skill of learning how to learn quickly, and there is the resilience that we are not turned upside down and defeated just because our former conception of ourselves and the roles we did is no longer viable. So there's actually going to be a big premium on people who are emotionally fit, emotionally have a high emotional intelligence. And in fact, there's going to be even more of a career in helping each other to be emotionally fit and emotionally resilient. So these are some of the ways in which I think the fourth industrial revolution is going to change work even more than in the last 10 or 20 years.
Do you think that within the context of adaptability, David, and I know this is something that your organization, London Futurists, likes to discuss, do you think that there is a wider conversation for us to be having about how, I mean, essentially we're talking about technological augmentation of our skills. We already do it to some extent with smartphones and, you know, access to the internet and the way technology has been integrated into the way we work, the way we live. Do you see that continuing as a norm for certain sections of society, or is it likely that there's going to be further splintering of hyper specialization of certain kind of competencies? I mean, whether that's something as science fiction as kind of neural augmentation, or just something a little bit simpler, like certain people being able to have access or spotting trends in, you know, mini certifications, as Lee said, and taking advantage of that. And how do you see that kind of playing out? And you know, for current maybe students or current professionals, is that something to kind of keep one eye on the road of?
Absolutely. We will be better able to do our work if we can resist some of our instinctual yuck feelings. Oh, I don't want to do that. I'd rather rely on my native skills. But no, if we are able to adapt to augmented reality glasses, now Google Glass didn't sweep the world quite as quickly as I had predicted, maybe 10, 15 years ago. But I think something like that will come in due course. It will help to help us to understand what we're looking at. Google Lens is a fantastic application in which we can point to the software at a picture and it will give you a good idea of what you're looking at. So there will be software running perhaps in our glasses, perhaps in our headsets, which are speaking to us. A bit like sometimes you're about to send an email and the software says, are you sure you want to send that email? You mentioned an attachment, but there's no attachment there. Or I wish I had the software earlier today. I misspelt the name of the person I was sending the email to, and I sent it, and I realized too late that I'd done it. And I wish the software had said, are you sure you want to misspell the name of the user? Well, I think
Absolutely.
more and more of that will be there. And it'll be a little bit like a guardian angel, potentially sitting on our shoulders, tapping us, guiding us, a little bit like a good friend. You know, a really good friend can sometimes give you an advice. All right, now you're getting too worked up about this. You need to let other people speak or whatever. So I think there will be software that allows us to do this. And some people instinctively say, no, 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 I don't want it. I have to say we have to learn how to take advantage of that software wisely so we can enhance ourselves and be more capable of working in the workforce alongside others who are enhanced, frankly.
Absolutely. And just to follow up on that, and final question before I go to Lee, I think we've discussed in the past kind of trends in the technology sector as a whole. Do you see there being particular winners and losers, and particular growth industries that are either extending what is presently there, or nascent industries that have yet to meet the fore, and some people may want to get an early kind of either thought leadership expertise in, or a potential career avenue?
So there are some industries that I would recommend people work in if they're open to do it. So the industry of mental health, if you're able to enhance people's mental health, I think there's going to be more and more of a demand for that. Then there's financial innovation for sustainability, as Martina was talking about. I think that's going to be a big growing area. There's going to be these derivatives, these new products, which we're all scared of because they were partly responsible for the terrible financial collapse of 2008, but actually done well, they can direct investment to the truly beneficial areas of society. And I think there's going to be a big growth in that area, which, by the way, Mark Carney, the former head of the Bank of England, has written about in his new book, Values, Building a Better World for All, in which he highlights a big role for financial innovation. So there are some careers which I would look to, but more than just picking a career, it's picking the skills to use inside that career. And I'm going to refer to the words of Mark Andreessen, the VC, formerly the pioneer of web browsing software, when he said 10 years ago or so, software is eating the world, by which he meant whichever industry you were in, unless you were good in your company at software, you were going to be outcompeted by others. Well, today, there are a bunch of new technologies that are poised to eat the world. It's not just software that's going to eat the world, it's going to be software written by AI. Is going to eat the world. And so whichever industry you're in, you need to be comfortable that you understand the strengths and weaknesses, what's true and what's not true, the hype and the reality of AI as the most important transformative technology. And if you can do that, you're more likely to succeed in whichever career and whichever industry you choose.
Absolutely. I'll come back to you, Lee, because I saw Martina maybe smiling at some of David's comments about use of derivatives. So I'm wondering if you have any further comments, Martina, or whether you wanted to add to that.
No, fully agreed. I don't know, some of you might know, I last year contributed to the AI book, also talking about the implications of ESG, fintech and AI, and recently done some papers with associates in the industry on this. And it's exactly that, you know, AI is enabling us to find new solutions, derivatives in that instance being, for instance, products. But you know, there is a vast array. When I look at ESG and the way we assess, rate, classify, benchmark, monitor, triage, and report on information, we are talking about an information industry. And, you know, to understand and to contextualize the trends, the risks, the behaviors, sentiments, you know, and the consistency of these different criteria. That's again where the human capital per se is currently not capable to manage these vast and unstructured data sets, especially at scale. And when and where, you know, we are talking now different jurisdictions, a much more global and globalized world, and universe, hence, of organizations and companies that we in financial services need to assess and classify in this sort of ESG system.
Absolutely.
And for that system, again, you know, and to identify potential controversies and breaches when and where legal implications are concerned, environmental and or social controversies occur in real time, to track this information. We are not getting away and around AI and fintech solutions. And that's exactly why I've been classifying them in the past as strategic enablers. And, you know, also been seeing them as some of these solutions that can help us to address inherent biases of, you know, ESG information when and where self-disclosure and annualized backward-looking information is concerned. If we're talking about forward-looking scenarios, we are talking about understanding long-term views and impacts. We need to have the means and tools to get there. And that's when you come back to technology.
Fantastic. I've just seen that we've got questions streaming in, Lee, but I'm just wondering if you want to comment on anything that Martina and David have said. Just a comment from my side. As David was mentioning, the kind of the ability to integrate one's technology into the way, you know, the way you work. I'm struck by the scale at which the nature of my job as a lawyer has actually been fundamentally restructured by technology. And as you said, you know, or alluded to, the legal sector is somewhat closed and perhaps somewhat close to change. And I also remember Richard Susskind giving this talk where I think it was back in the early 90s, he predicted that the primary method by which lawyers would communicate with their clients would be email. And apparently he was in a room full of partners that just kind of laughed him out the room. They were like, there's no way that's going to happen. It's always going to be by letter, you know, very traditional. And over time, it's kind of just transitioned into that. So as well as any comments you have about what we're discussing, is there the possibility that maybe that transition isn't going to be as painful as maybe we think?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good, I mean, I think maybe there's 3 points I'll make based on the conversation and your point, Kenneth. First, I think the skill that everyone, and our children will have to deal with is, we talked about literacy and numeracy, but it's really about data fluency, because everything is going to be data driven. And let's be honest. You know, the best machine learning, best AI scientist needs the best data, biggest data set. It just thrives on data. And as Martina said, most of it's unstructured in many areas. I mean, if you take ESG in that scenario, I do quite a bit of work on. Look at all of the things that are basically essentially non-financial reporting, right? And how are you going to translate that? And how does it become meaningful to? And so I would first say that data literacy and how we deal with data, and I'll go even further. What's our personal relationship to data? Because the little vignette that David shared with us with this, you know, with somebody sort of whispering, telling us, you know, for others that's like the surveillance economy gone amok, right? I mean, how much do you know about me that you can anticipate, you know, what I'm about to do or not do? So we're all going to have to find out, and this is a normative question, right? This is really about what we value. You know, if we're going to put the person first, and how much agency are we going to have? And it could be all of these things. Of course, we want our physicians to have data and certain technologies to augment what they're doing. And flip it around, we also know that in mental health issues, that actually augmented sort of computing can be better treatment for some people with autism and other things that need treatment that necessarily makes it very difficult if they interact with other people. So there are a lot of positives in all of this, but we still has a fundamental issue of what's our comfort level? How much data do we want to share? Do we want to have access to? How do we want to deploy it? How much data do we don't have? The data we don't have, which is a lot of the work on ESG and other areas, particularly with biodiversity. People forget that in this October that there'll be a major biodiversity co-op a week before the Glasgow Summit on Climate. It's going to be, you know, the only way to deal with climate will be through you know, natural solutions, right? And we have to think about this, but we don't have the data. So again, I would just say it's got to be about data, our relationship to data, and we need to figure that out and sort it out as a society, and then we'll see where it takes us. And then to your point, you know, about you know, the piece about being a lawyer and will this all help us or not? There's a bigger discussion about how much, what is the real productivity gain here? A number of economists have sort of pointed out that we really haven't seen it. And we're also seeing that, you know, in the past century, you know, high school education led to great productivity gain. I mean, the last century was a college education. 2 centuries ago was a high school education. What kind of education is going to lead to the productivity gains that people are expecting today? And again, I think it goes. My fundamental thesis is that people who are very, very adept at spotting, connecting, deploying data to make better decisions, that will be the persons I think that will shift us in the productivity curve.
Fantastic. Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more, Lee. I think, yeah, I mean, in many ways, it does feel like we're all collectively staring into this crystal ball, which is very much, you know, clouded by the lack of data fluency or the lack of data per se. So yeah, completely agree with that. And just to draw upon and leading into the questions, the first question is from Paul. And I think it's something that I can put to all you guys generally. Paul asks, how can finance or technology address the social disparities augmented by globalization, the elephant curve? I think just to draw that out a little bit more, I think as well as the social disparities, I think the notion that some of these trends might allow us to reverse or at least mitigate growing income inequality and inequality in society, does that hold promise, or is that a facade? Is also something that is a very kind of pertinent question. So I think, actually, to be honest, drawing upon the finance element of this question particularly, I'd like to go to you, Martina. So how can finance address the social disparities augmented by globalization? I guess that comes down to perhaps more the S and the G of ESG, but yeah, welcome your thoughts.
Sure. I think, you know, the World Economic Forum actually in 2020 found, you know, in order to tackle environmental issues such as climate change and habitat loss and social issues, you know, very much on the sustainable development agenda, ranging from poverty through to inequality, could be tackled by harnessing the power of technology. And they've launched a dedicated campaign around Vision 2030, which I think is quite interesting to take a look at, because it combines the elements of 4IR, which David just highlighted, together with the aspirations of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. You know, we have huge financing gaps here. We also have the challenge that even public-private partnerships or the private sector per se in developing innovation in the fields of health or clean energy or innovation and infrastructure, whatever that might be, on its own is potentially not sufficiently capable to tackle all of these challenges, at least not at once and not within this decade, as Agenda 2030 highlights. So ultimately, I think we need stronger collaboration between these different type of actors. I'm a strong believer and advocate in active ownership, engagement, dialogue, and collaboration. And again, through these type of joint ventures, ultimately, also between smaller fintech companies and then the organizations that are helping to finance these, working then together with the organizations such as the multilateral organizations that are trying to address these higher macro level issues, we might have a chance. But it still remains to be seen, what can be really achieved on and at the bottom line. And therefore, I think it's important to move the needle steadily, but definitely on a specific topic and theme. I give you an example. We are members of the Climate Action 100+ Coalition. We are members now of a biodiversity pledge, and most recently of the newly formed coalition around the just transition, to not only look at environmental and specifically climate issues in separation, but to really move the trajectory for positive change and the needle when and where we can contribute as investors, as actors within the ecosystem, to really drive meaningful change. And we need to see this type of collaboration at large, and we need to see that as a collective, ultimately, not as a very competitive peer versus peer model, which I think has been historically one of the major challenges in our industry, that has also really now with ESG has turned the initial models when and where competition, when and where organization, when and where brand is concerned, on its head. The future, again, of organizations that are surviving, that are adapting to an ever-changing landscape and that are showing the best resilience are the ones that are working alongside the trajectory for collaboration. And for me, again, that is also part of this positive change trajectory as highlighted and supported by the Partnering for the Goals, hence, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals framework.
Absolutely. So actually drawing upon this topic, Lee, and also alluding to something that you mentioned in terms of kind of addressing these, what are really normative questions and normative issues that we need to reconcile. Do you feel like there is a key, a key factor in kind of developing a new relationship between perhaps how we view the state and private actors? And is there some kind of synergy there that maybe either established professionals or people just starting out in their career need to be wary of, in terms of that being a different kind of factor as to what we have been used to seeing over the last maybe 10 to 20 years?
I think so, and I speak on Martina's point. I think there's a narrative around stakeholder capitalism, which is very collaborative, right? Which is to say, it's not state capitalism, and we're familiar with that, and there's parts of the world that are very much driving that. There is, of course, traditional shareholder, but stakeholder means really having those conversations and building those coalitions and partnerships. And having, I also think there's a point, maybe just to augment what Martina said. We know one thing from this crisis, and if you go and go online to the Edelman Trust Barometer, sort of confidence in government's down, but it's actually quite high in business. It's made a turn since the financial crisis, because if you think about it, like, look, where did these vaccines come from? Where, a lot of things have been mobilized in research. So it's been a very good story. And I think even enterprise is willing to step up, and you've heard the US Business Roundtable endorse stakeholder capitalism. At the World Economic Forum, we've made that a central theme, and we've been actually advocating that for 50 years. But I do think there's something governments can do in all of this too. And this is a bit that they have to shift their focus from, I might use maybe software terms, but they've been so focused on functionality and not usability. And that's the one thing we learned in this crisis, is that since so often they were so focused on, what they, the function of what they're doing without trying to understand the impact they're having by focusing on usability. And I think we've all have our own little horror stories about it. Despite their best intentions, their use of sort of, making it easier to work with government, easier to get to those services. It's just been so difficult. And I think their government can step up. But for the moment, I think it's a great opportunity for businesses to embrace stakeholder capitalism, talk about how they can help their communities and map out and really engage various stakeholders. And I think that will also make our societies more resilient in the end, because let's not kid ourselves. There'll be other shocks, and we're not out of this yet. So that's something to reflect on.
100%. So David, as well as commenting on some of the topic areas that Lee just mentioned, it strikes me that one of the elephants in the room is trying to get a handle on where we think innovation comes from, and particularly innovation that has maybe societal applications. And we probably have good mechanisms for innovating to deliver shareholder value. But does this kind of discussion around the relationship between public and private actors and a renewal of the same, does that need to be rejigged in terms of thinking about innovation in your experience and, you know, from the conversations that you've had, and any further thoughts on that?
So I'm a fan of industrial strategy, by which I mean that there are things that the free market and VCs will happily invest in and will encourage. But some of the most important things won't happen without the leadership of public investment, which governments are best placed to do. It's a controversial thing because people say, well, what does governments know? Governments always get things wrong. Governments always invest in white elephants. There's yet another elephant in here, white elephant projects. But in fact, there are plenty of examples around the world where the right kind of leadership from governments have helped countries to go forwards in leaps and bounds. I look, for example, at South Korea, a situation I know pretty well. So I am a fan of sometimes there must be some leadership from the public sector to draw attention to various areas that the market by itself may not be able to reach. And one of the examples there is a change in direction for the whole economy, which will perhaps solve the other elephant curve issue that was raised earlier in Paul Critchton's question. So my understanding of the elephant curve was that there are a certain group of people who were particularly disadvantaged or left behind by the changes in the last 20 years. The richest of the rich have been doing very well. And actually, even the poorest have been doing reasonably well. They haven't grown quite so much, but they have, on the whole, around the world, came out of poverty in unprecedented numbers. The people who have felt most badly done by many of the changes in the last 20 years are the middle classes of formerly developed countries. And for generation after generation, people in these classes had seen their salaries rise and rise. But in the last period of time, in America, since about 1975 or so, the median salary has no longer been going up. The average salary, the mean has, but when you look at people ordered, the majority of people's well-being has not been going up so much. And it's led to a crisis in identity. It's led to a deep dissatisfaction. It's led to more people getting angry. Some people have coped with it, but other people haven't coped with it. And it's led to an adoption of various unhealthy political or religious movements. How do we address that? And I don't think it's going to be addressed simply by saying, let's have more money, more money, more money. I think what technology can do is it can help people to realize that they can have a better quality of life, more flourishing, without necessarily having salaries going up, up, up. What I'm talking about here is sometimes called the Star Trek economy, in which more and more of the things which are essential to life are lower and lower cost or essentially free. And that is the direction in which the politicians should steer the economy from now on. That instead of thinking, how can we raise the GDP as the measure of all the financial transactions, we should be saying, how do we ensure that more and more people, even though they don't have so much finance, actually have a very rich and wonderful quality of life? So lower and lower cost, good quality housing, lower and lower cost, good quality education, lower and lower cost, good quality health. And that is a different direction for innovation than just leaving the market to do its own thing. And what I'm really saying here is that the skill we're almost going to need, we've talked about resilience, we've talked about emotional intelligence. Arguably the most important skill to guarantee our well-being in the future is politics. And when I say politics, it's not politics with a small p, meaning how do we interact with other people, it's politics with a big P. How do we influence the political system so that they actually cause what people in the World Economic Forum have sometimes called the Great Reset, but it's a change towards a truly sustainable way of living in which there is a growth in human flourishing without a corresponding growth of impact on the environment or even a growth in impact on wealth.
Amazing. Lee, over to you. I'm dying to hear what you have to say about the Star Trek economy and any related thoughts.
No, I think you know, I agree with David very much. I mean, we understand today, you know, it's a simple question. In many parts of the world, if you asked a young person today, do they think they'll earn as much or more than their parents? The answer would be no. In fact, they're probably living in their same home with their parents, and that's the problem. But I do think there is a way, and David's right. I mean, I mean, there's a lot in all of this, but really, I think we can't have an economy anymore with so many externalities. That's one, and that's the SG piece that we're talking about. Second, we do have to put people back in the center of the economic narrative. And indeed, we can do that. And I think you see in many parts of the world are really actively trying to really create a base. I mean, it's not about universal basic income, but it's really about a universal sort of basic lifestyle that we should all have and access to the services. And we learned that, right? I mean, again, going back to who were the essential people during this COVID crisis, reflect on them. They're probably the lowest paid persons that we know. In most instances, they're not highest. They're, you know, if they were that important, so essential, why doesn't that reflect in wages? Well, maybe something is wrong with the system there, right? And I think it's worth reflecting upon. And then I do think on the political piece, I think there is something, a discipline that's, you know, I'm actually writing a case on it on systems leadership. That's the politics, the big P. How do you change the system? My thesis is you have to change the narrative and the direction, but you have to point to a better sort of purpose. And this purpose orientation and finding the coalition of the willing, and maybe here the Pareto principle work, maybe it'll be just 20% that can effectuate 80% of the change we need to see, but we'll see more of that. And I subscribe to it is a politics with a big P, but maybe it's really about systems change and systems leadership, and that will require you know, a different way of framing and understanding issues today, but also different skills. But I do think that's the direction we are headed. I think you're welcome to challenge me on that, but I think that it will be the direction we're going towards.
No, I think. Broadly agree. I think one thing that strikes me with everything that we're discussing, and certainly if I was back in my law student days, it seems like a lot of what we're discussing is the building up or aligning certain existing infrastructure and building new infrastructure around these incentives, around these new systems. And for someone who's either starting out or is quite junior in their career, it seems like there would have been a question in my mind, in order to have that impact or to be able to, you know, engage maybe in politics with a big P, not necessarily as a politician, but just have that kind of impact. Is you know, for someone who's starting out now, do I take an entrepreneurial risk or just a general risk with my career and engage with, for example, working for a startup that is engaged in sustainability from the ground up? Or do I work with an established name to kind of build up my own professional reputation? And in my mind, get to a stage of reputation that allows me to kind of leverage that for that impact. Now, I personally think in many ways that's probably a false dichotomy, but you know, in terms of like how you'd respond to someone who put that to you or thinking about that problem conceptually, any kind of responses to that?
Well, quick one. I think, you know, what you're describing in some ways is of course, there's, I think, a social entrepreneur in all of us. And the entrepreneur, we identify that unmet need, right? But I think you could be an entrepreneurial as well. You can be in a large organization and push the envelope, and as much as being outside of an organization. And I think we're not, you know, I think too often we sort of separate the two and say you're going to be an employee or an entrepreneur. And I think, you know, it's a misconception. I've seen plenty of entrepreneurs who've given license to change and see things in the system. And don't forget, the next generation wants it. You know, going back to David's point, I mean, I've read an article today. It's very hard to find jobs for people, even though, I mean, fill jobs in the United States, because people are sort of wondering, well, do you have healthcare and childcare and other things? Because these are all the things I need now. I don't need, you know, it's not about the wage. It's about these other things. And I think we're going to have people inside companies sort of change the system and rethink that and become entrepreneurial. So yeah, I do think it's a bit of a false debate, because I think I think what's common though is that there's a sense of social entrepreneurship that's really developing in almost everyone's work that I've come across, and whatever,
Absolutely.
a big company or small company, there's that social purpose piece that I think helps people sleep well at night.
Mm-hmm. And just on that social purpose piece, Martina, a question that I think should be right up your alley. This is from someone who's anonymous, unfortunately, but the question is, recently the price to emit 1 ton of carbon dioxide hit a new high in the European emissions trading system. How do you see the role of carbon prices in the economy today and in the future?
Well, it's an important question. First of all, the challenges of carbon pricing and to create a level playing field is definitely one that is needs to be overcome, because we currently have different systems and markets that obviously apply different models and prices to this. But in the context of delivering the relevant solutions that we addressed or highlighted a bit earlier, we need to think, what type of pricing as well as incentive schemes could we set to actually keep carbon emissions within the realms and the trajectories that would get us to the 1.5 to 2 degrees. And I don't know if you've seen, there have been interesting studies around most recently that many of the current commitments that are in industry, even towards net zero carbon, that we have seen from policymakers, around the national contribution targets alongside the Paris Agreement, that none of these will actually be sufficient to get our world into that trajectory. So what we now need in this particular decade, again, the decade of action, as it has been classified, Agenda 2030, we need to have a system, and that starts with ways of regulation and taxonomies, frameworks. We've seen that here coming out of the European Union. We need a Green Deal that has also come out of the European Union that actually incentivizes, right, the relevant investments also into infrastructure in areas that really spearhead development. But we also need a system that actually allows a level playing field, especially for trading of carbon and of the development of products. And so hence, I think it's important to have such systems. But again, conundrums remain. And one of the other major conundrums we touched on a bit earlier is the clarity around the data around even something like carbon emissions. There is confusion around scope 1, 2, 2 to 3 in particular, and what that entails. There's double accounting. There's currently even a call for better accounting towards net zero carbon, which is something that the IIGCC, the Institutional Investors Group, put forward. And I'm very much aligned with this idea to move the needle and to discuss these type of topics outside of finance, also within accounting. And this is something which was highlighted, I think, by Lee just a moment ago, the idea to also create clusters, universalists that actually look beyond the area of specialism is something that we need to address and tackle jointly as society and also within organizations in order to overcome these conundrums, to say that ESG is just an area for, say, the finance field, the CSR team, or the product and solutions providers. Ultimately, it's a strategic question, and it has implications for the entire organization. And to that, I also up and foremost count, of course, the finance and accounting departments. And that's a transformational change again, which is slowly but steadily happening, and there is a need for this to happen in order for all of these other equations and calculations around prices and pricing also to happen side by side.
Absolutely. And just to follow up on that, Martina, it strikes me that, the challenge is definitely, as you say, trying to integrate those externalities into the current system in a way that they can be measured, in a way that can be managed. But in addition, even if that problem is solved, I guess there's still the issue of trying to solve for human nature. I mean, you mentioned double counting, sorry. There may be instances where, there may be instances of, outright fraud. There may be instances of greenwashing. How do you see those challenges in the context of how the industry needs to mature to deliver the impact that it's intended to? Because it's not just a localized risk for that company and a bad reputation. What we're talking about is kind of structuring a system that allows us to deal with a multilateral problem.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think there's on the one hand greenwashing, on the other hand competence washing. And these are two major big areas, bubbles, future risks that are already very predictable and are already, of course, happening. We talked about some of the data biases that are directly linked to these disclosures / conundrums, linked to disclosures, for instance, where self-reported information is concerned, and that is not necessarily always accurate and sometimes even misleading. I think having a multi-pronged approach of assurance and verification by multiple stakeholders, again, that name also came up by Lee, I think earlier on in that process, may that be independent verification providers, ESG research and rating houses, may that be also the due diligence processes, hopefully that investors should have in place. We need to have an increasing, literally a system of controls, governance and due diligence that will help us to get more clarity. And again, a wider array of data, multiple data points, literally helping to get a conclusive picture on the same issue or problem is something that could help here as well. And again, if I look at satellite technology and imagery to literally address the issues around physical climate risk, specific to certain locations, and then calculating scenarios and simulations around how to address seawater rise, how to actually identify areas for wildlife fires or areas of drought and their potential impact. These type of additional data points can help us to close the current gaps to see what ultimately state actors or companies are reporting, to get really the independent insights. And again, that's why I think having a system, an ecosystem that provides verification and assurance, multiple state and private actors working together, in tackling information and data issues that we actually face at large is one way to tackle this. But by no means will we always have the guarantee, and where does that actually exist, that this is 100% accurate.
No, absolutely. But I think that's a very worthy response, that it's not just a regulatory or compliance tick box that we're trying to build out here. It's it's almost a real-time visibility for the reputation of a company that is both independently and probably quite simply verified with as far as possible real-time data on a multi-stakeholder basis. So absolutely. Yeah, I mean, on that basis, Lee, just coming back to the fourth industrial revolution, question from Yusuf, who asks, I'm wondering how the fourth industrial revolution will pan out in the developing world. Are those regions of the world going to skip a phase or two, jump right ahead with the newest technology, or perhaps the alternative, as it built into Yusuf's question?
Well, I think they have the opportunity to be most technologically enabled in terms of, if you think about, there have been leapfrogging, right? Some of the interesting mobile payment systems and the sort, and even incredible entrepreneurs in rideshare and other areas. Maybe there's two things I think that will be challenging, because most companies today know that's a huge growth opportunity. I mean, and we could just look at the demographics, right? But maybe there's two to think about in this fourth industrial revolution. One of the lessons we learned is the power of these platforms, and it's sort of a winner-take-all world. So I hope that the platforms are more indigenous or local, at least. I mean, think of the case of Europe and really the lessons we ought to learn in terms of these platforms, right? We're a little bit too late, although we're shaping the norms and looking at the obviously the competition policy around that. But there's something to be said, because when we talk about the fourth industrial revolution, we're also talking about these very, very effective platforms, and it'll be very interesting to know the relationship there. Secondly, it goes back to an opportunity around what Martina was saying, is that maybe we have to figure out a way to use technology, but also the right incentives to make sure that their growth trajectory is one where they can achieve the same net zero goals as the rest of the world. And I think consumers will change, and they'll adapt as long as you produce value for them. And it's really about the value that we deliver. But I'm very optimistic, but at the same time, it's really key to understand in this fourth industrial revolution around what we've learned from these platforms, and we're still learning how. We still don't know really how to really govern them. And secondly, how can we use that technology to already maybe leapfrog the industrialized world when it comes to some of the things we need to do when it comes to enabling nature-based solutions and other areas.
Absolutely. David, just tagging on to that, and along the lines of the same question, the impact of the fourth industrial revolution in the developing world and the promise thereof. Any comments on that?
So I think this will vary from country to country considerably. I don't think we can just say that all countries in the developing world status will have the same evolution. It will depend a lot on the local politics, frankly. Just as if we go back 30 or 40 years ago, some countries that were in a reasonably poor state then have come forward in huge leaps and bounds due to a combination of hard work and reasonably enlightened politics in the circumstance, whereas others haven't. If I look around the world, I used to point to Ethiopia as a good example of an African country which had embraced many of the technologies. They have significant AI startups there. I know things have gone badly in the last year or so, so I'm not quite sure if that is just an external shock or what, but there is a lot of variation around the world, and the local conditions will matter. And when I say local conditions, I mean the actions by individual people. So let's not buy into any kind of deterministic picture. I want to say people make a difference, and culture makes a difference, and it's up to people to connect in the right way. If you are in a developing country now, there's all to play for. By all means, look for technology to help, but also look to connect with the networks of people who will make a difference. And if I can briefly give my answer to a question, Kenneth, you asked a while ago, which is, should people prefer to work in startups or in large corporations? And the answer was, well, you can do well in either, and I agree, but perhaps the most important thing is, who are the people who will be your colleagues? Because if you work in either of these type of companies, but you have colleagues who are focused on narrow objectives, short-term profits, and so on, it's going to be bad for you as well, because guess what? The attitude of your colleagues rubs off on you, whether you like it or not. So picking the right colleagues is a good step forwards for your career. And of course, it's not always obvious in advance. It might look like you're joining a great company, but when you get there, the colleagues aren't any good. Well, then you need to dig in and move. But it'll also help if you've got friends there already who can honestly report. And so for people in the third world who are figuring out how they can help steer their countries to get good advantage of the fourth industrial revolution, pick your networks wisely well. And I will come to the skill of collaboration. That's really what this is. Knowing which communities are helpful to you, which networks are important to you. We are going to succeed in this, not as individuals, not even as individuals augmented by technologies, but as individuals who can connect in the most productive way to helpful networks. And so the skill of collaborative intelligence is probably going to differentiate those of us who have good careers from those of us who have less good careers.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more, David. And yeah, and I alluded to the fact that I thought of that as I now appreciate that's a false dichotomy. It's not something I appreciated when I was a law student. But from my perspective, just building on what you've said, I think the focus is, and this is something you alluded to, the focus is on developing skills that you can represent and deliver as having market value. And that doesn't necessarily live in one place. You can develop that in a startup, you can develop that in a larger setting from my experience. And I think absolutely that's really developed by the type of people you have around you and the colleagues in the environment that you interact with. I'm just conscious of time, so I think what I'm going to do is, it would be great if we could just do a final round robin of the panelists, maybe just wrapping up with your final thoughts and maybe any final bits of advice for our listeners. Really appreciate all the insights and all the questions from our audience, but I think I'll hand over to our panelists for final words. So if it's all right with you, Martina, would you like to kick things off?
Sure. I think, from today's discussions, really what's resonating is, again, adaptation, transformation, and resilience. And not necessarily in this order, but this is something, that's a suicidal topic now, right? As we are discussing it here, it's also definitely a topic that's resonating in investment decision-making, especially if you look at the increasing drive and momentum in thematic investing, looking for specific macro and micro themes and adapting your investment strategy, as well as in approaches. I highlighted active ownership. clearly, you know, through this collective momentum, collaboration for engagement and dialogue, we are achieving scope and scale never seen before in this specific arena, linked to climate, ecological, and or the just transition. And this is momentum that can only, again, be achieved collaboratively, and when and where we need to work with all the actors, the stakeholders, as it was stated, across the value chain. And that's, again, why these type of topics are so important, because we get most of the impulses, the ideas, the concepts, the innovation from discussions and from the pollination that happens in circles like this, you know, where thought leaders meet industry experts, where academia and science is influencing decision making. And I think this is an important aspect now more so than ever, also in the context of the universalists that we discussed, and something we should definitely get grip of and hold on to, especially as I think Lee highlighted a bit earlier as well, or was it David, that the skills of the future will be determined as well by the people that are able to adapt and interconnect. And ultimately, this is what ESG is about.
Fantastic. Thank you, Martina. Lee, would you like to go next?
Thanks. Yeah, I just want to build from that. I think, you know, the future, in terms of when you think about the future work and our roles, I would just, you know, build off of both Martina and David's points, maybe in three ways. One, you know, Isaiah Berlin talked about, you know, the fox and the hedgehog, and in technology, we all think we have to become the hedgehog, really know that tech, but it's going to change all the time. It's really about the fox. It's knowing a little bit about a lot of things is going to be the value. Start there, and being able, as Martina says, connecting the dots based on those things, you know. I would say that's the second piece. And third is to identify the stakeholders and know of each of those dots you connect and know how to work with them. It's a bit like David's point about how you work with. So it's really fundamentally those three things, because we think of technology in the future as sort of having to get this, you know, reskilling or getting this deep understanding. No, it's about knowing how things connect, who connects them and what purpose, and having yourself know, you know, understanding what you would like to do with that, having that sense of purpose. Because, you know, those are the things that, going back to sort of David's thesis about the sort of networked economy and networked companies, well, you have to think that way too and act that way. And that means working across different stakeholders and connecting things that are yet unconnected. And I think that's the real skill set. And I think if you can do that, you also build your resilience. That's the other side, I would say.
Fantastic. And last but certainly not least, David, over to you to bring us home.
So the title of tonight's event was Careers of the Future, but I think the common message is that skills of the future are sort of more important than individually picking a career. And we've given time to skills which we believe will help you listeners to succeed in whichever career you choose, given the greater turbulence and disruption that's likely to come ahead. We've talked about a number of skills. One that maybe we haven't talked about enough, and which I'll use as my closing, is the skills of communication. That is sharing messages. When Lee did talk at the beginning about narrative, he mentioned the book by Robert Schuller, which I confess I haven't read, Narrative Economics, so that's going to go on my to-do list. I read his previous book on irrational exuberance a long time ago and enjoyed it. So the importance of narrative is critical. And it's critical to succeed in some of the great transformations we're facing. So if we really want to solve climate change, which we do, we need a whole bunch of things, as has been mentioned, that we need the carbon price, we need wise investment mechanisms, we need more transparency, but we also need to be good at having conversations about climate change in a way that doesn't make people angry or upset, because we are all, to an extent, feeling guilty or shameful. We're all, to an extent, in denial about our roles in climate change, and it's very hard to have these discussions. So I'm going to refer to another book by an Australian social science researcher, Rebecca Huntley, which is How to Talk About Climate Change in a Way That Makes a Difference. And I think what she highlights there is the importance of understanding emotions. And we're going to live in increasingly emotional times because of all the turbulence and shocks ahead. And we're going to need to be better at managing these conversations to succeed in changing the climate in a successful way, to succeed in changing politics in the way we need, to succeed in changing the direction of society so that we really are living sustainably rather than unsustainably as at the moment. And if we can tell these narratives, not just in a superficial way, I'm not talking about fake news here, and heavens enough, there's enough people who are sadly skilled at that, but authentic communications, then I think that's a very important skill for us all to succeed. Fantastic.
All that's left for me to do is to thank everyone for attending, for your thoughtful questions, to our panelists for the insightful discussion points. Just to note to everyone, we're going to put together a virtual goodie bag, which is just a collection of links, videos, resources, tying together some of the resources that have been mentioned on the call, and then a couple of others for you to explore some of these themes further. Thanks to everyone for attending. We hope you found it insightful, and yeah, have a lovely evening, and good luck with structuring your future career opportunities.
Thanks, David. For steering us through this, Kenneth.
Thank you, Kenneth.
Great job.
Thank you. Excellent job, Kenneth. Thank you. Bye-bye.